The snowstorm had rolled in faster than anyone could have predicted, transforming the dense forest into a world of swirling white. Mark, a retired forest ranger pushing 60, sat alone in his isolated cabin, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. The bitter aroma filled the air, mingling with the scent of pine from the crackling fireplace. Outside, the wind howled against the sturdy wooden walls, a constant reminder of the ferocity of nature. Mark's cabin, nestled deep within the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, had been his sanctuary for the past 5 years. It was a simple structure, built with his own hands from local timber, standing as a testament to his desire for solitude. The main room housed a small kitchen, a worn leather armchair, and bookshelves lined with field guides and novels. A narrow hallway led to a sparse bedroom and a bathroom with just the basics. It wasn't much, but it was home. As he gazed out the frosted window, Mark's mind wandered to the life he'd left behind. The cabin had become more than just a refuge, it was an escape from a past that clung to him like a shadow. Memories of his days as a ranger, the camaraderie with his colleagues, and the sense of purpose that came with protecting the wilderness all seemed like distant dreams now. But with those good memories came the weight of decisions he'd made, mistakes that had driven him to seek this self-imposed exile. The storm outside grew angrier, rattling the shutters and blanketing the world in an impenetrable fog of snow. Mark had seen his fair share of blizzards during his years in the service, but this one felt different. There was an urgency in the air, as if the storm was trying to tell him something. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Years of solitude had made him prone to such fanciful ideas. As the day wore on, Mark busied himself with small tasks around the cabin. He stoked the fire, its warmth a stark contrast to the frigid world outside. He checked his supplies, mentally tallying the cans of food and gallons of water that would see him through the storm. It was a routine he'd perfected over the years, a dance of survival that had become second nature. As evening approached, the storm showed no signs of letting up. The wind's howl had become a constant companion, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the cabin's timber frame. Mark settled into his armchair with a dog-eared copy of Jack London's The Call of the Wild, finding a strange comfort in the tales of survival against the harsh wilderness. Just as he was about to turn a page, a sound broke through the howling winds, a rhythmic scratching accompanied by muffled whines. At first, Mark thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him. But as the sound persisted, a frown creased his forehead. He set down his book and coffee, rising slowly from his chair. With cautious steps, Mark made his way to the front door. Years of ranger training kicked in as he approached, his senses on high alert. Wild animals sometimes sought shelter during storms, and while Mark respected nature, he knew the dangers of cornered wildlife. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, listening intently. The scratching came again, more urgent this time, accompanied by a whimper that tugged at something deep within him. Taking a deep breath, Mark slowly opened the door, bracing himself against the rush of frigid air and swirling snow that immediately assaulted him. What he saw sent a jolt through his chest, momentarily robbing him of breath. There, on his snow-covered porch, stood a golden retriever. Her fur was matted with ice and snow, her body trembling visibly against the cold. But it wasn't just the dog that caught Mark's attention. Tucked close to her, seeking whatever warmth and protection she could offer, were 3 small puppies. The sight hit Mark like a physical blow. The mother dog's eyes met his, and in them, he saw a desperation that spoke volumes. It was a look he recognized from his ranger days, the silent plea of a creature in dire need of help. The puppies, barely visible against their mother's snow-covered fur, whimpered softly, their tiny bodies shivering uncontrollably. For a moment, Mark stood frozen, his mind racing. He'd chosen this life of solitude, had built walls around himself both literally and figuratively. Taking in these animals would mean breaching those carefully constructed barriers. But as he looked into the mother dog's eyes, something stirred within him, a long-dormant sense of duty and compassion. "Come on in, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He stepped back, opening the door wider. The golden retriever hesitated for just a moment, her instincts warring between the need for shelter and the wariness of human interaction. Then, with slow, limping steps, she made her way inside, gently nudging her puppies ahead of her. As they crossed the threshold, the warmth of the cabin enveloped them. The contrast between the howling storm outside and the sudden quiet inside was stark. Mark quickly closed the door, shutting out the wind and snow. He turned to look at his unexpected guests, now huddled just inside the entryway, leaving small puddles of melting snow on the worn wooden floor. In the warm light of the cabin, Mark got his first good look at the bedraggled family. The mother dog's golden fur, though matted and dirty, hinted at a former glory. Her body was thin, ribs visible beneath her coat, telling a story of hardship and struggle. The puppies, 3 little balls of fur, couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. They pressed close to their mother, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. As Mark knelt to inspect them, something about the mother dog's gaze caught his attention. There was a depth to her eyes, a look that felt oddly familiar. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd seen this dog before, but the urgency of their condition pushed the thought to the back of his mind. Moving with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, Mark set to work. He retrieved an old blanket from a chest, spreading it out near the fireplace. With gentle hands, he coaxed the mother dog and her puppies onto the makeshift bed. The mother's movements were stiff and pained, and Mark made a mental note to check her for injuries once they were settled. Next, he filled a bowl with water and placed it within easy reach of the dogs. The mother lapped at it gratefully, while Mark used a clean cloth to gently wipe the snow and ice from the puppy's fur. As he worked, he spoke softly, his voice a low, soothing murmur. It had been years since he'd spoken this much, and the words felt strange on his tongue. "You're safe now," he told them, not sure if he was reassuring the dogs or himself. "We'll get you warmed up and fed. Don't you worry." As the puppies began to stir more, their tiny voices gaining strength, Mark felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It was a foreign sensation, one he hadn't experienced in longer than he cared to remember. The simple act of caring for these vulnerable creatures was awakening something in him, chipping away at the walls he'd built around his heart. With the dogs settled by the fire, Mark moved to the kitchen area. He rummaged through his cupboards, searching for something suitable for his unexpected guests. He found some canned chicken, which he mashed into a soft paste. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do until he could figure out something better. As he set the food down for the mother dog, their eyes met again. In the warm glow of the fireplace, with the storm still raging outside, Mark felt a connection forming. This dog and her puppies, against all odds, had found their way to his isolated cabin. As he watched the mother tenderly care for her young while keeping a wary eye on him, Mark couldn't help but feel that perhaps they had been brought here for a reason. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of activity. Mark found himself constantly checking on the dogs, adjusting the blanket, refreshing their water. The puppies, growing bolder as they warmed up, began to explore their immediate surroundings, their clumsy movements bringing an unexpected warmth to the cabin. As night fell and the storm showed no signs of abating, Mark prepared for bed. But instead of retreating to his bedroom, he made himself comfortable in his armchair, unwilling to leave his guests unattended. As he drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sound of the wind and the soft breathing of the dogs, Mark felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. In the dark of the night, with the fire burning low, the mother dog lifted her head. Her eyes found Mark's sleeping form, and for a moment, she seemed to study him. Then, with a soft sigh, she laid her head back down, her body curled protectively around her puppies. In that moment, in the midst of the raging storm, a fragile peace settled over the cabin, a promise of new beginnings and second chances. The next morning dawned with a muted glow, the storm having softened to a gentle snowfall. Mark awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar weight on his legs. He looked down to find one of the puppies had crawled onto his lap during the night, its tiny body rising and falling with each breath. The sight brought an unexpected lump to his throat. As he carefully shifted the puppy back to its mother, the events of the previous night came rushing back. The golden retriever raised her head, her amber eyes meeting his with a mix of wariness and gratitude. In the clear light of day, Mark could see the toll their journey had taken on her. Her coat, though still matted, showed signs of what must have once been a beautiful golden sheen. "Well," Mark said, his voice rough with sleep, "guess we better get you all cleaned up." He stood, stretching muscles stiff from a night in the armchair, and made his way to the kitchen. As he put on a pot of coffee, his mind raced with plans for the day. He'd need to check the dogs for any injuries, clean them up, and figure out a more suitable food situation. The cabin, which had been silent for so long, was now filled with the soft whimpers and yips of the puppies as they began to stir. Mark found himself smiling at the sounds, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee he was sipping. It had been years since he'd had any company, let alone the responsibility of caring for others. The thought was both daunting and oddly exhilarating. With a bowl of warm water and some clean towels, Mark set to work. He approached the mother dog slowly, speaking in low, soothing tones. "Easy there, girl. I'm just going to clean you up a bit, okay?" To his surprise, she allowed him to approach without protest, her eyes following his every move. As he began to gently clean her fur, Mark's ranger training kicked in. His hands moved methodically, checking for injuries as he worked. The dog had some minor cuts and bruises, likely from her journey through the forest, but nothing seemed serious. It was when he reached her left hind leg that he felt her flinch. "Ah, so that's what's troubling you," he murmured, noting the slight swelling around her ankle. While he worked, Mark's mind wandered. There was something about this dog, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The way she watched him, the tilt of her head, it all felt strangely familiar. But that was impossible. He hadn't owned a dog in years, not since. The thought trailed off as a memory surfaced, sharp and clear despite the years that had passed. Buddy. His faithful companion during his years as an active ranger. The golden retriever who had been by his side through thick and thin, until life had forced them apart. But Buddy was long gone, rehomed with a neighbor when Mark had been forced to take a desk job in the city. That was over a decade ago. Shaking off the memories, Mark turned his attention to the puppies. They were more energetic now, tumbling over each other as he tried to clean them. Their antics brought a chuckle to his lips, a sound so foreign in the usually quiet cabin that it startled him. As he handled each puppy, checking them over, he couldn't help but marvel at their resilience. Despite their ordeal, they seemed to be in good health, their little bodies wriggling with life and energy. As the morning wore on, the cabin transformed into a flurry of activity. Mark found himself constantly moving between tasks, feeding the dogs, cleaning up messes, and trying to puppy-proof the main living area. It was exhausting work, but he found himself energized in a way he hadn't felt in years. During a lull in the activity, as the puppies napped in a pile by the fire and their mother dozed nearby, Mark took a moment to really look at her. The nagging feeling of familiarity wouldn't leave him. Her fur, now clean and beginning to dry, was the same rich golden color he remembered Buddy having. And there, just visible now that the dirt was gone, was a small white streak along her nose. Mark's heart began to race. It couldn't be. He knelt down slowly in front of her, hardly daring to breathe. "Buddy," he whispered, the name feeling strange on his lips after so many years. The dog's reaction was immediate. Her ears perked up, her head lifting to look directly at him. There was a spark of recognition in her eyes that sent a jolt through Mark's entire body. It was impossible, and yet... "Oh my God," Mark breathed, his voice cracking. "Buddy, is it really you?" As if in answer, Buddy let out a soft whine and shifted closer to him. Her tail, which had remained still until now, began to wag hesitantly. Mark reached out a trembling hand, and Buddy pressed her nose into his palm, just as she used to do all those years ago. The flood of emotions that washed over Mark was overwhelming. Joy, disbelief, and a crushing wave of guilt all battled for dominance. Buddy was alive. Somehow, against all odds, she had found her way back to him. And not just her, she had brought her puppies, entrusting them to his care in their time of need. Tears blurred Mark's vision as he gently stroked Buddy's head. "I'm so sorry, girl," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I never should have left you. Can you ever forgive me?" Buddy's response was to inch closer, resting her head on Mark's knee. The simple act of trust and forgiveness broke something open inside him. For the first time in years, Mark allowed himself to truly feel the regret, the loneliness, and now, the faint stirring of hope. As he sat there, with Buddy's warmth against him and her puppies sleeping nearby, Mark's mind raced with questions. How had she survived all these years? How had she found him, here in this remote cabin? And what had happened to bring her to his doorstep in such desperate condition? The rational part of his mind knew that he might never have answers to these questions. But in that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that Buddy was here, that by some miracle, life had given them both a second chance. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Mark found himself talking more than he had in years, telling Buddy about his life since they'd parted. He knew she couldn't understand his words, but the act of sharing, of reconnecting, felt profoundly healing. As evening approached, Mark set about making dinner, for himself and for his new charges. He'd managed to find some rice in the back of a cupboard, which he cooked and mixed with the remaining canned chicken. It wasn't ideal dog food, but it would do for now. He made a mental note to make a supply run as soon as the weather cleared. Watching Buddy eat, Mark couldn't help but notice how thin she was. Whatever journey had brought her here had clearly been a difficult one. He vowed silently to help her regain her strength, to care for her and her puppies with everything he had. As night fell and the cabin grew dark save for the glow of the fire, Mark found himself on the floor next to Buddy's makeshift bed. The puppies had curled up against her, their little bodies rising and falling with each breath. Buddy's eyes, warm and trusting, remained fixed on Mark. "I don't know how you found me, old friend," Mark said softly, his hand resting gently on Buddy's back. "But I promise you, I'm not going anywhere this time. We're in this together now, you and me and these little ones." Buddy's tail thumped softly against the blanket, as if in agreement. As Mark prepared for bed, this time retreating to his bedroom but leaving the door open, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The cabin, which had for so long felt like a self-imposed prison, now felt like a sanctuary, a place of new beginnings. That night, as the wind whistled around the cabin and snow continued to fall softly outside, Mark fell asleep to the gentle sounds of Buddy and her puppies breathing. His last thought before drifting off was one of gratitude, for the storm that had brought them to him, for the chance to make amends, and for the promise of a future that suddenly felt full of possibility. In the quiet of the night, Buddy lifted her head one last time, her eyes finding Mark's sleeping form in the darkness. With a contented sigh, she settled back down, secure in the knowledge that she had found her way home at last. As the fire crackled low in the hearth, the cabin stood as a testament to the enduring power of love, forgiveness, and the unbreakable bonds that can form between humans and animals. The days that followed Mark's reunion with Buddy passed in a blur of quiet activity and wordless companionship. The storm outside had settled into a gentle, persistent snowfall, blanketing the world around the cabin in a soft white silence. Inside, the atmosphere was charged with an unspoken understanding, a fragile peace that neither Mark nor Buddy seemed willing to disturb with unnecessary noise. Mark found himself moving through his daily routines with a newfound sense of purpose. Each morning, he'd wake early, start the fire, and prepare breakfast for himself and his canine family. As he worked, Buddy would watch him from her spot by the fireplace, her amber eyes following his every move. The puppies, growing stronger and more curious by the day, would tumble around her, their playful yips and growls providing a cheerful counterpoint to the quiet. As Mark prepared their meals, mixing the rice and chicken with some canned vegetables he'd found in the back of his pantry, he couldn't help but marvel at the strange turn his life had taken. Just a week ago, he had been alone, his days marked by a monotonous routine of survival. Now, his small cabin was alive with activity, filled with the sounds and smells of life. Buddy's presence brought back a flood of memories from his ranger days. He remembered long hikes through the forest, Buddy trotting faithfully by his side. He recalled quiet evenings by campfires, her head resting on his knee as he kept watch. These memories, once painful reminders of what he'd lost, now felt like a bridge between his past and his present. As the days wore on, Mark began to notice changes in Buddy. The wariness in her eyes slowly gave way to trust, and her tail, once tucked close to her body, began to wag more freely. She still moved with a slight limp, her injured leg taking time to heal, but her spirit seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The puppies, too, were thriving under Mark's care. He'd taken to calling them Rusty, Scout, and Daisy, names that seemed to fit their emerging personalities. Rusty, the largest of the three, was bold and curious, often the first to investigate new sounds or objects. Scout, with her sleek golden coat, was quick and clever, always finding new hiding spots in the cabin. Daisy, the runt of the litter, was gentle and affectionate, often curling up in Mark's lap when he sat by the fire. One afternoon, as Mark sat in his armchair reading, he felt a gentle nudge against his hand. Looking down, he saw Buddy standing beside him, a worn tennis ball in her mouth. The sight nearly took his breath away. It was a game they'd played countless times during their years together, but he'd never expected to see it again. With hands that trembled slightly, Mark took the ball. Buddy's tail wagged, her eyes bright with anticipation. "You want to play, old girl?" Mark asked softly, his voice rough with emotion. In response, Buddy gave a soft woof, backing up a few steps. Mark stood, rolling the ball gently across the cabin floor. Buddy moved quickly despite her limp, snatching up the ball and bringing it back to him. As they continued their game, Mark felt a warmth spreading through his chest. It was more than just the joy of playing with his old friend, it was the realization that Buddy had forgiven him, that she still trusted him enough to play and relax in his presence. The game attracted the attention of the puppies, who tumbled over each other in their excitement to join in. Soon, the quiet cabin was filled with the sound of barking, laughter, and the scrabble of paws on wooden floors. For the first time in years, Mark found himself truly laughing, the sound strange but welcome to his ears. As the days passed, Mark began to notice other changes in himself. The weight of guilt and regret that had been his constant companion for so long began to lift. He found himself smiling more, talking to Buddy and the puppies as he went about his daily tasks. The silence that had once felt like a refuge now seemed oppressive, and he found himself filling it with quiet conversation and even the occasional song. One evening, as Mark sat by the fire with Buddy at his feet and the puppies sprawled around him, he felt compelled to speak. "I owe you an apology, Buddy," he said softly, his hand resting gently on her head. "I never should have left you behind. I thought I was doing what was best for you, but I was wrong." Buddy lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a quiet acceptance that brought tears to Mark's eyes. "I don't know how you found me, or what you've been through," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I promise you, I'm not going anywhere this time. You and these little ones, you're my family now." As if understanding his words, Buddy shifted closer, resting her head on his knee. The puppies, sensing the emotional moment, crowded around, their warm bodies pressing against him. In that moment, surrounded by the unconditional love of his canine family, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm finally having passed. As Mark stepped outside to check his supplies, he was struck by the beauty of the world around him. The forest was transformed, every branch and needle coated in a layer of glistening white. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the promise of a new day. Buddy followed him out, her paws crunching in the fresh snow. She stood beside him, her shoulder pressed against his leg, as they surveyed the winter wonderland before them. The puppies, experiencing snow for the first time, bounded out after them, yipping with excitement as they discovered this new, cold substance. Watching the puppies play, Mark felt a sudden urge to join them. Without overthinking it, he bent down and scooped up a handful of snow, packing it into a loose ball. "Hey, Rusty," he called out, tossing the snowball gently. The puppy watched in confusion as the snowball fell apart mid-air, showering him with a spray of white flakes. His bewildered expression was so comical that Mark found himself laughing out loud. Soon, the area in front of the cabin was filled with activity. Mark threw snowballs for the puppies to chase, while Buddy watched from the porch, her tail wagging contentedly. The sound of laughter and barking echoed through the trees, a joyful noise in the usually quiet forest. As the morning wore on, Mark realized he needed to make a supply run. The unexpected additions to his household had depleted his stores faster than anticipated, and he needed to stock up on proper dog food and supplies. The thought of leaving, even for a short time, filled him with a sudden anxiety. He looked at Buddy, remembering the years they'd spent apart. "I have to go into town," he told her, kneeling down to meet her eyes. "But I promise, I'll come back. You're safe here, okay?" Buddy tilted her head, as if considering his words, then gave his hand a gentle lick. Mark took it as a sign of understanding and trust. The drive into the nearest town was a surreal experience. Mark hadn't left his cabin in months, and the sight of other people, even from a distance, felt strange. As he loaded his truck with bags of dog food, puppy supplies, and groceries for himself, he felt a sense of urgency. Every moment away from the cabin felt like a moment too long. When he finally pulled up in front of his cabin, he was greeted by an enthusiastic welcoming committee. Buddy stood on the porch, her tail wagging, while the puppies tumbled over each other in their excitement. As Mark unloaded the supplies, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He was home, and his family was waiting for him. That evening, as Mark sat in his armchair with Buddy at his feet and the puppies sprawled around the cabin, he reflected on the changes of the past week. The silence that had once defined his existence was gone, replaced by the gentle sounds of breathing, the occasional puppy yip, and the crackle of the fire. But more than that, the silence in his heart, the void left by years of guilt and regret, was slowly being filled. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Mark realized that the reunion he'd experienced wasn't just with Buddy. It was a reunion with a part of himself he'd thought long lost, the part that could love, trust, and find joy in the simple moments of life. In the quiet of the night, with his newfound family sleeping peacefully around him, Mark felt a sense of hope for the future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he wouldn't have to face them alone. As the weeks passed, the once quiet cabin transformed into a bustling hub of activity. The change was gradual at first, almost imperceptible, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Where silence had once reigned, there was now a constant symphony of life, the patter of puppy paws on wooden floors, the jingle of makeshift collars, and the occasional bark or whine punctuating the air. Mark found his daily routine completely upended. Mornings, which had once been a slow, solitary affair of coffee and contemplation, now started with a cacophony of excited yips and the urgent need to let the puppies out. He'd stumble out of bed, often before the sun had fully risen, to be greeted by 3 pairs of eager eyes and wagging tails. All right, he'd grumble good-naturedly, reaching for his boots. Hold your horses, you little rascals. The puppies, Rusty, Scout, and Daisy, had grown significantly in the weeks since their arrival. Their personalities were becoming more distinct with each passing day. Rusty, true to his name, had developed a rich, reddish tint to his coat and a mischievous streak a mile wide. He was often the instigator of trouble, leading his siblings on daring expeditions under the porch or into the depths of Mark's closet. Scout, sleek and observant, had taken to following Mark around the cabin, her intelligent eyes watching his every move. She seemed to be trying to understand the workings of their little world, from the way Mark chopped wood for the fire to how he prepared their meals. More than once, Mark had turned around to find Scout sitting quietly behind him, head tilted in curiosity. Daisy, the smallest of the trio, remained the gentlest. She was content to curl up in any available lap, her soft golden fur a constant temptation for petting. Mark found himself absent-mindedly stroking her head while reading or during his evening contemplation by the fire. Her presence was a soothing balm, easing the lingering edges of loneliness that sometimes crept in. Buddy, for her part, watched over her brood with a mixture of patience and exasperation that Mark found endearingly familiar. She'd recovered well from her ordeal, her coat regaining its luster and her limp all but disappearing. In quiet moments, when the puppies were finally asleep, she'd often seek out Mark's company, resting her head on his knee in a gesture that spoke of trust and companionship. The cabin itself seemed to come alive with the presence of its new inhabitants. Corners that had gathered dust for years were now thoroughly investigated by curious puppy noses. The old rug in front of the fireplace, once pristine, now bore the happy evidence of puppy play, a chewed corner here, a small stain there. Each mark was a reminder of the new life that had breathed into the space. Mark found himself making changes to accommodate his new family. He fashioned makeshift barriers to keep the puppies out of areas that might be dangerous, using old boards and furniture. He cleared a space in the main room for a puppy play area, complete with toys he'd picked up on his supply runs to town. An old basket, lined with soft blankets, became a cozy bed for the growing pups. The cabin's exterior didn't escape transformation either. Mark spent several days repairing and extending the old fence that surrounded the property, creating a safe space for the dogs to play outside. He cleared a path through the snow, trampling it down to make it easier for the puppy's short legs to navigate. The sight of the 3 golden balls of fur tumbling through the snow, with Buddy keeping a watchful eye, never failed to bring a smile to his face. One particularly memorable afternoon, Mark decided it was time to introduce the puppies to the joys of fetch. He dug out an old tennis ball, worn and faded but still bouncy. Buddy's ears perked up at the sight of it, her tail wagging with remembered excitement. "You remember this game, don't you, girl?" Mark said, giving her an affectionate pat. Buddy gave a soft woof in response, her eyes fixed on the ball. Mark stepped out onto the porch, the puppies tumbling after him in a flurry of excitement. He held up the ball, capturing their attention. "Okay, kids, watch and learn," he said, then tossed the ball gently across the yard. Buddy was off like a shot, her old instincts kicking in as she raced after the ball. The puppies watched in confusion for a moment before the excitement got the better of them. They charged after their mother, yipping and stumbling through the snow. Buddy retrieved the ball with practiced ease, trotting back to Mark with her prize. The puppies, not quite understanding the game but thrilled to be part of it, danced around her legs, trying to snatch the ball. Mark couldn't help but laugh at the scene. "Good girl, Buddy," he said, taking the ball and giving her a rewarding scratch behind the ears. "All right, who wants to try next?" What followed was a hilarious and heartwarming afternoon of puppy education. Rusty was the first to grasp the concept, charging after the ball with enthusiasm if not grace. Scout approached the game with careful consideration, seeming to analyze the ball's trajectory before making her move. Daisy, not to be left out, would often simply follow her siblings, happy to be part of the excitement even if she didn't quite get the ball. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the snowy yard, Mark called an end to the game. The puppies, tired but happy, followed him and Buddy back into the warmth of the cabin. As he prepared their dinner, the sound of contented puppy snores filled the air, the little ones having fallen asleep in a pile by the fire. That night, as Mark sat in his favorite chair with Buddy at his feet, he reflected on how much his life had changed. The cabin, once a refuge from the world, had become a home in the truest sense of the word. The silence he had once cherished was replaced by the sounds of life and love, and he found he didn't miss it at all. The changes weren't just in his surroundings, Mark realized. He was changing too. The hard edges of his self-imposed isolation were softening. He found himself talking more, not just to the dogs but to himself, filling the air with words that had gone unspoken for too long. He sang as he worked around the cabin, old songs from his youth that he'd almost forgotten. The sound of his own laughter, once so rare, now echoed through the rooms with increasing frequency. Even his interactions with the outside world were changing. His supply runs to town, once rushed affairs where he avoided eye contact and conversation, became more relaxed. He found himself chatting with the cashier at the general store about puppy food brands, sharing a laugh with the hardware store owner about the challenges of puppy-proofing a cabin. These small interactions, once avoided, now felt like a lifeline to the wider world. One evening, as a gentle snow fell outside, Mark sat at his small desk, a piece of paper in front of him. He hadn't written a letter in years, had actively avoided reaching out to old friends and family. But now, with the warmth of his new family surrounding him, he felt the urge to reconnect. "Dear Jim," he wrote, addressing his old partner from his ranger days. "I hope this letter finds you well. I know it's been a long time, and I owe you an apology for my silence." As he wrote, pouring out the story of Buddy's return and the puppy's arrival, Mark felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. He realized that in opening his home to Buddy and her puppies, he was also opening his heart to the possibility of rebuilding the human connections he'd let slip away. The cabin came alive in other ways too. The smell of fresh-baked bread began to fill the air as Mark rediscovered his love for baking. He dug out old recipe books, trying out treats that he could share with his canine family, in moderation, of course. The sound of music became a regular feature, with Mark unearthing his old radio and tuning into stations that played the classic country songs he'd loved in his youth. As spring began to tease the edges of winter, bringing with it longer days and the first hints of green, Mark stood on his porch, surveying his little kingdom. Buddy sat beside him, her presence a constant comfort. The puppies romped in the muddy patches where snow had melted, their joyful barks echoing through the trees. Mark took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp mountain air. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive, truly present in his own life. The cabin, once a self-imposed prison, had become a place of rebirth, of second chances. As he watched Buddy gently herd her puppies back towards the porch, Mark smiled. He was home, in every sense of the word, and he was no longer alone. As spring fully blossomed in the mountains, Mark found himself embracing a new rhythm of life. The harsh winter had given way to mild days filled with sunshine and the cheerful songs of returning birds. The forest around the cabin burst into life, painting the landscape in vibrant greens and splashes of wildflower colors. For Mark, this awakening of nature mirrored the reawakening he felt within himself. With the warmer weather came new challenges and opportunities. The puppies, now several months old, had boundless energy that needed direction. Mark, drawing on his years of experience as a forest ranger, decided to channel their enthusiasm into training. Every morning, after their breakfast, he'd take Buddy and the pups out for long walks in the surrounding woods. These excursions served multiple purposes. They allowed Mark to reacquaint himself with the forest he'd once known so well, observing the changes that had occurred during his years of self-imposed isolation. He pointed out different trees and plants to the puppies, speaking their names aloud as if the dogs could understand. In a way, he felt like he was relearning the forest himself, seeing it through new, appreciative eyes. "See that tree there, Rusty," he'd say, pointing to a towering pine. "That's a ponderosa. And over there, Scout, those purple flowers. Those are lupins." The walks also provided an opportunity for basic obedience training. Mark worked patiently with each puppy, teaching them to come when called, to sit and stay. Buddy, ever the attentive mother, seemed to assist in these lessons, demonstrating the desired behaviors for her offspring. Rusty, true to his mischievous nature, often tested Mark's patience during these training sessions. He'd dart off after squirrels or butterflies, ignoring Mark's calls to return. But Mark found that his old ranger skills of tracking came in handy, and he always managed to find the wayward pup. These little adventures often led to discoveries of hidden glades or babbling brooks that Mark had forgotten existed. Scout, on the other hand, took to training with an almost scholarly dedication. She watched Mark intently, seeming to analyze his every command before executing it perfectly. Her intelligence both impressed and slightly unnerved Mark. "You're too smart for your own good," he'd often tell her, receiving a tilted head and curious eyes in response. Daisy, sweet-natured as always, was eager to please but easily distracted by the wonders of the forest. A floating dandelion seed or a particularly interesting rock could capture her attention mid-command. But her gentle demeanor and affectionate nature made it impossible for Mark to feel frustrated with her. As the days passed, Mark noticed a change in himself. The weight of guilt and regret that had driven him to isolation began to lift. In caring for Buddy and her puppies, in rediscovering his love for the forest, he found a sense of purpose he'd thought long lost. The cabin, once a self-imposed prison, became a base for new adventures and learning. One sunny afternoon, as Mark sat on the porch whittling a stick while the dogs played in the yard, he had an epiphany. He realized that his years of ranger experience, combined with his deep love for the forest and its inhabitants, could be put to use. He could become a steward of this small part of the wilderness, protecting it and educating others about its importance. With this new sense of purpose, Mark threw himself into projects around the property. He cleared old trails that had become overgrown, marking them with signs identifying local flora and fauna. He repaired the old bird feeders that hung from the trees around the cabin, delighting in the variety of feathered visitors they attracted. The puppies watched these new guests with fascination, learning through Mark's gentle guidance not to chase or bark at them. Mark's renewed connection with nature sparked a desire to share his knowledge. He began keeping a journal, meticulously recording his observations of the changing seasons, the behaviors of local wildlife, and the growth progress of various plants. He sketched the tracks he found on their daily walks, noting which animal had left them and under what conditions. This journal, he thought, could one day be a valuable resource for others interested in the local ecosystem. As his project grew, Mark found himself venturing into town more frequently. He needed supplies for his trail maintenance and materials for the educational signs he was creating. These trips, once a source of anxiety, became opportunities for connection. He struck up conversations with the locals, sharing his plans and listening to their own stories and knowledge of the area. At the general store, he met Sarah, a retired biology teacher with a passion for local ecology. Their conversations about native plant species and wildlife conservation often stretched for hours. Sarah's enthusiasm matched Mark's own, and he found himself looking forward to their chats. She offered to lend him some of her biology textbooks, expanding his knowledge and providing scientific names for the plants and animals he'd known only through observation. Through Sarah, Mark learned about a local conservation group that worked to protect the mountain ecosystem. Intrigued, he attended one of their meetings. As he listened to discussions about trail maintenance, wildlife protection, and education initiatives, Mark felt a familiar spark ignite within him. This was the world he'd left behind years ago, but now he was seeing it with new eyes and a renewed sense of purpose. After the meeting, Mark approached the group's leader, an energetic woman named Linda. He hesitantly offered his services, explaining his background as a forest ranger and his recent projects around his property. Linda's eyes lit up at the mention of his experience, and soon Mark found himself volunteering to lead nature walks and assist with trail maintenance projects. As he drove home that evening, Buddy in the passenger seat beside him, the puppies were now old enough to be left alone for short periods. Mark felt a sense of excitement he hadn't experienced in years. He was no longer just existing in the forest, he was becoming an active part of its preservation and appreciation. Back at the cabin, Mark's new commitments led to some changes. He set up a small office area in one corner of the main room, with a desk for his nature journals and a bookshelf for the growing collection of field guides and ecology books he was accumulating. The puppies quickly learned that this was a quiet zone, often curling up at his feet as he wrote or sketched. Mark's renewed purpose also influenced his interactions with the dogs. He began incorporating more structured activities into their daily routines, seeing them not just as pets but as potential partners in his conservation efforts. He worked on training Buddy and the pups to walk quietly on trails, not to disturb wildlife, and even to help with simple tasks like carrying small packs with water and supplies on their longer hikes. One memorable day, as they were exploring a less traveled part of the forest, Scout's keen nose led them to an injured fawn hidden in the underbrush. Mark's ranger training kicked in as he carefully approached the animal, assessing its condition. With Buddy keeping the other pups at a safe distance, Mark was able to splint the fawn's injured leg and carry it back to the cabin. He called the local wildlife rescue, and together they were able to ensure the fawn's recovery and safe return to the wild. This incident reinforced Mark's belief in the importance of his new path. He realized that by being present in the forest, by understanding and caring for it, he could make a real difference. The dogs, with their keen senses and trainable natures, could be valuable allies in this mission. As summer approached, bringing with it longer days and warmer temperatures, Mark found himself busier than he'd been in years. Between his volunteer work with the conservation group, his ongoing projects around the property, and the never-ending energy of the now adolescent puppies, his days were full from dawn to dusk. But unlike the wearying busyness of his past life, this activity filled him with energy and purpose. One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset behind the mountains, Buddy resting at his feet and the puppies playing in the yard, Mark reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The path had been long and often painful, marked by guilt, regret, and self-imposed isolation. But it had led him here, to this moment of peace and purpose. He looked down at Buddy, her graying muzzle a reminder of the years that had passed. "We've come a long way, old girl," he said softly, scratching behind her ears. Buddy looked up at him, her eyes full of trust and affection. In her gaze, Mark saw not just the companion of his ranger days, but a symbol of resilience, forgiveness, and the enduring power of the bond between humans and nature. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Mark felt a deep sense of contentment wash over him. He had found his place in the world again, not despite his past but because of it. In this cabin, with these dogs, and in this forest, he had found not just a new purpose, but a new home. As summer faded into fall, the forest around Mark's cabin transformed into a breathtaking tapestry of reds, oranges, and golds. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. For Mark, this change of seasons marked nearly a year since Buddy and her puppies had stumbled into his life, forever altering its course. The puppies, now almost fully grown, had become an integral part of Mark's daily life and work. Rusty, Scout, and Daisy had each found their own way to contribute to Mark's newfound purpose as a steward of the forest. Rusty, with his boundless energy and keen nose, had become an excellent tracker. Mark had trained him to locate specific plants and animals, a skill that proved invaluable during nature walks and conservation efforts. On one memorable occasion, Rusty had led Mark to a patch of rare wildflowers that the local conservation group had been trying to locate for years. Scout, true to her name, had developed into a natural patrol dog. She seemed to have an innate sense of when something was amiss in their territory. Whether it was a fallen tree blocking a trail or wildlife in distress, Scout always managed to alert Mark. Her intelligence and attentiveness made her an ideal companion on Mark's longer treks through the forest. Daisy, the gentlest of the three, had found her calling as a therapy dog of sorts. Her calm demeanor and affectionate nature made her perfect for educational programs with children. When Mark hosted school groups for nature walks, Daisy was always a hit, patiently allowing excited kids to pet her and often helping shy children feel more at ease in the forest setting. Buddy, now showing more gray around her muzzle but still spry, watched over her brood with obvious pride. She had settled comfortably into her role as Mark's constant companion, always by his side whether he was working on trail maintenance or writing in his ever-growing collection of nature journals. One crisp autumn morning, as golden sunlight filtered through the colorful canopy above, Mark set out on a walk with his canine family. The air was filled with the sounds of crunching leaves and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. Mark breathed deeply, savoring the familiar scents of the forest he now knew like the back of his hand. As they walked, Mark reflected on the changes the past year had brought. His involvement with the local conservation group had grown significantly. He now led regular nature walks, teaching visitors about the local ecosystem and the importance of preservation. His cabin had become a hub for environmental education, with the cleared trails and informative signs drawing amateur naturalists from all over the state. More than that, Mark had rediscovered a part of himself he thought he'd lost forever. The guilt and regret that had driven him into isolation had been replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. He was no longer hiding from the world, but actively engaging with it, making a difference in his own small corner of the wilderness. As they crested a small hill, Mark paused, taking in the vista before him. The valley stretched out below, a patchwork of autumn colors as far as the eye could see. Buddy pressed against his leg, a warm, solid presence. The younger dogs ranged ahead, noses to the ground, tails wagging with excitement at the sense of the forest. "Look at that, guys," Mark said softly, more to himself than the dogs. "Isn't that something?" As if in response, Buddy gave a soft woof, her tail wagging gently. Mark chuckled, reaching down to scratch behind her ears. "You're right, old girl. We are lucky, aren't we?" They continued their walk, with Mark pointing out interesting plants and animal signs to the dogs as had become his habit. He knew they couldn't understand his words, but the sound of his voice seemed to keep them attentive and close. As they neared a small stream, a familiar figure came into view. It was Sarah, the retired biology teacher who had become a close friend over the past year. She was kneeling by the water, examining something intently. "Morning, Sarah," Mark called out as they approached. "What have you got there?" Sarah looked up, a wide smile spreading across her face. "Mark, just the man I wanted to see." She stood, brushing dirt from her knees. "And you've brought the whole gang, I see." The dogs, familiar with Sarah from her frequent visits to the cabin, greeted her enthusiastically. Daisy, in particular, pressed close, always eager for Sarah's gentle pats. "I've found something interesting," Sarah said, gesturing to the stream bank. "Come take a look." Mark joined her, peering at the spot she indicated. There, half hidden in the mud, was a distinct footprint. It was large, with clear claw marks at the tips of the toes. "Is that what I think it is?" Mark asked, excitement creeping into his voice. Sarah nodded, her eyes sparkling. "Bear track. And a fresh one at that." probably from last night or early this morning. Mark felt a thrill run through him. Bears weren't uncommon in these parts, but sightings were rare. This track was evidence that the forest was healthy, supporting large predators as it should. "This is great, Sarah," Mark said, already mentally composing the entry he'd make in his nature journal. "We should let Linda and the conservation group know. They'll want to document this." As they discussed the implications of the bear sighting, Mark felt a familiar sense of purpose wash over him. This was why he was here, why he'd chosen to reconnect with the forest and the wider world. Every discovery, every moment of wonder, reaffirmed his decision. They spent the next hour examining the area, finding more tracks and signs of the bear's passage. The dogs, picking up on their excitement, ranged around them, noses to the ground, occasionally letting out soft woofs of interest. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Mark and Sarah decided to head back to the cabin. They walked side by side, discussing plans for a community education event about local wildlife. The dogs trotted around them, Buddy staying close while the younger ones darted off to investigate interesting scents before racing back. Back at the cabin, Mark invited Sarah in for coffee. As he moved around the kitchen, preparing their drinks, he was struck by how natural it felt to have company. A year ago, the thought of someone in his space would have filled him with anxiety. Now, it felt right. They sat on the porch, mugs in hand, watching the dogs play in the yard. The conversation flowed easily, touching on topics from the bear sighting to upcoming conservation projects to Sarah's grandchildren's recent visit. As Sarah was leaving, she paused, turning to Mark with a serious expression. "You know, Mark, I'm really glad you decided to join our little community. You've made a real difference here." Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot." After Sarah left, Mark sat on the porch steps, surrounded by his dogs. Buddy rested her head on his knee, while the younger dogs sprawled around him, tired from their morning adventure. As he sat there, enjoying the peace of the moment, Mark's mind wandered back to the day Buddy had shown up at his door with her puppies. He remembered the storm, the fear and uncertainty, the sudden disruption to his solitary existence. He could never have imagined then how that moment would change his life. In taking in Buddy and her puppies, Mark had been given a second chance. A chance to right the wrongs of his past, to reconnect with the world he'd turned his back on, to find purpose and meaning again. And in return, he'd given Buddy and her puppies a second chance at a loving home and a purposeful life. Mark looked out over the forest, his forest, feeling a deep sense of contentment. The path that had led him here hadn't been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of struggle, of having to confront the guilt and regret he'd carried for so long. But sitting here now, with the warmth of the dogs around him and the beauty of the forest before him, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Mark stood up, stretching his back. "Come on, gang," he said to the dogs. "Let's head inside." The dogs perked up at his words, following him into the cabin. As Mark closed the door behind them, he paused for a moment, his hand on the doorknob. He thought about the man he'd been a year ago, closed off and alone, and the man he was now, surrounded by love and purpose. Second chances, he murmured to himself, a small smile playing on his lips. Then he turned to his family, ready to end another day in the life he'd never expected but now couldn't imagine living without. As night fell over the forest, the cabin glowed with warmth and life. Inside, Mark sat in his favorite chair, a dog-eared nature guide in his hands, and his canine family sprawled around him. The sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl provided a perfect backdrop to the peaceful scene. Mark's eyes drifted to the photos now adorning his walls, pictures of the dogs, of the forest in various seasons, of himself with Sarah and other members of the conservation group. Each image told a story of growth, of connection, of a life reclaimed. As he settled in for the night, Mark felt a deep sense of gratitude. For Buddy, who had found her way back to him against all odds. For the puppies, now grown, who had brought new life and purpose to his world. For the forest, which had welcomed him back with open arms. And for the second chance he'd been given, to live a life of meaning and connection. In the quiet of the night, with Buddy's gentle snores and the puppy's occasional sleepy whimpers filling the air, Mark drifted off to sleep. His dreams were filled with images of sunlit forest paths, playful dogs, and the faces of friends both old and new. In his sleep, he smiled, at peace with his past and looking forward to whatever adventures tomorrow might bring.